Hello, everyone, and welcome. It's really nice to see everyone online. If you are here new to the ESG Exchange, I'm just going to give you a very brief overview of the ESG Exchange and what we're all about. The ESG Exchange is a coalition of active collaborators. We were started by the Good Governance Academy, and we're really trying to solve the problem of the limited sustainability expertise. We do that through our provision of how-to playbooks. And our how-to playbooks are currently, our first one is in preliminary consultation, and we're expecting to publish that more broadly by the end of the month, early in perhaps mid-March, depending on feedback. This is a little bit about the coalition of organizations that are participating. We have 4 different stakeholder groups. Of course, the sustainability standard setters themselves, as well as the second stakeholder group being public authorities and regulators, the non-profits, educators, professional associations, and finally then the for-profit consulting and for-profit organizations, asset managers, legal companies, etc. So if you are an expert, please, we encourage you to go and apply to join our technical committee, and it's a technical committee that gets together to build these how-to playbooks. With that, I'd like to hand over to Alex to introduce the panelists today. Just to say that our chat function is open, so please let us know where you're from. And our emojis and our reactions are also open. So if you like what people are saying, please thumbs up, clap, and give us some feedback from your side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carolyn. Greetings to everyone from Cape Town, South Africa. I'm Alex Hetherington of the First Line Group. Welcome to this, our first ESG Exchange, first Tuesday's webinar of 2024. And what a discussion this one promises to be. Public confidence in carbon credits, it can be said, is at a low ebb presently. To be sure, there are 2 markets. There's the public international market, allowing countries to trade carbon credits between themselves. And then there's the voluntary carbon market, which is typically used by companies to offset their greenhouse gas emission profiles. The international market, governed by Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, has been slow to take off. And the voluntary market has been quagmired in negative media, accusation of greenwashing, and even accusation of carbon cowboys. We couldn't ask for a better panel to help us unpack this thorny topic. Former president and CEO of the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and now a senior fellow at the Institute, Scott Bourne, has written extensively on this topic. Economist and Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change lead author, Anton Cartwright, is a director of Credible Carbon, a carbon project originator and carbon credit registry. Anton has specific viewpoints on what makes for a credible carbon credit. And then finally, but by no means less in any way, we have Joanna Cabello from the Center on Research on Multinational Companies. She is a senior researcher on climate justice with broad experience of investigating and campaigning around climate, environmental, and social justice issues. Just to reiterate, there will be plenty of time for questions and answers. Typically, these webinars, we spend half an hour in panel discussion, and then we open it up to you, the audience, to come in with any questions that you have directly for specific panelists, if you like, or open up a general question and I will facilitate from there. So let's get stuck right in on this topic. Scott, is there a misunderstanding of exactly what a carbon credit is and what it is meant to achieve?
Great, thanks, Alex. I'm also delighted to join you. I mean, I think this is a $64,000 question. I mean, I think ideally we know what a robust or a high integrity carbon credit looks like. So, for example, I'm here in Canada, and today I'm running my furnace because it's around -10. So if I think that that emit, say, one, 100, let's say 1 ton of CO2 equivalent, then I would say, okay, well, can I find a place where I can offset that 1 ton and from either from a tropical forest, which are really problematic, or from, let's say, a windmill in Kenya, or from solar panels or electric buses, and they would avoid that 1 ton that I'm emitting today. So the idea would then be that I would buy the equivalent of that 1 ton, and that would be a certified emission credit. So that's the general idea. So the sort of the principles of it are that, one, you need to have the arithmetic and the auditing and the standards to ensure that that is verifiable. And then also it's a matter of arithmetic. Is that, does my 1 ton of emitted today, is it equivalent to the 1 ton of avoided from the electric bus in Kenya, for example? So it gets immediately very complicated. And that's why this topic you're having today is as contested and as hotly debated as probably any under the Paris Climate Agreement.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Just very quickly, could you also to give a little bit of an indication as to a couple of the key principles behind carbon credits? And I'm specifically talking here about additionality, leakage, ownership, etc.
Well, those are the, and I'm sure my colleagues and the audience as well will get into these, but those are the sort of the base. So how do you know that a ton is actually credible, or is it a high integrity? So one would be that I would need to prove the counterfactual, that by me buying the sort of time on a solar panel in Kenya, from that additional funding that I put into it, the emissions would somehow be avoided. So you have to prove the counterfactual. And this has gotten into this key issue of additionality is really now at the sort of the forefront of the debates, both on the voluntary carbon markets, but also now in the formal public sector markets under Article 6, because proving the counterfactual of additionality is really complicated. The former mechanism, the clean development mechanism called the Kyoto Protocol, some of the analysis said this wasn't additional at all. It would have taken place anyways. And actually, some of these projects actually led to an increase in emissions. So that's the first part. I mean, second is leakage. There's plenty of examples of projects where buyers have bought, say, 100 hectares of tropical lands, and so, perhaps those lands have actually then avoided deforestation, but guess what? Deforestation actually went right next door and probably accelerated more than if that land had not been bought. And then the leakage issue is, if you buy that carbon credit, particularly for nature-based solutions, for carbon sequestration, how long is that supposed to last? And nothing is forever. And particularly now, everything. So if you look at the extent of wildfires and forest degradation around the world, if you assume that that carbon is going to be locked into trees, that's really now a problematic assumption because of the extent of now degradation. And then the final one I would say, and it's probably I'll leave to my colleagues on this panel, but out of these, and all these are really complicated, but the single most one is just the social issue of the S of the ESG that you and your colleagues are working on, because there's plenty of examples of projects where they bought land, particularly in developing countries, and guess what? They forgot to tell the landowners, the indigenous communities, the local communities, that they were actually buying their lands, commodifying them, and selling them on an international market for which they're getting no proceeds. So those are the four, if you think about the four big stumbling blocks, the three of them, I would say, are things that auditors, Gillian Tett from the Financial Times said a couple of months ago, the salvation to the Paris may at the end be auditors and accountants who figured. But the social issue is, I would say, more complicated, because this gets at issues around free prior informed consent and other issues.
Okay, thank you for that. If it's the auditors at the end of the day that are going to be a primary beneficiary, I can imagine that that's contestable in the first place. Anton, I'm going to bring it into you. You have for many years placed focus on and concern around this very social issue in terms of carbon credits. Can you just elaborate a bit on those concerns of yours and perhaps how they can and should be addressed?
Sure, and thank you, Alex, and yeah, Great to be chatting to everyone. I'm going to circle around to that answer, Alex, if that's okay to you, because I think just at this stage of the conversation, it's important to distinguish what, in my mind anyway, is an important distinction between ostensibly a good idea. I hope it's a good idea. It's certainly one that captured my imagination in 2001 or something, which is this idea of making the polluter pay. In other parlance, maybe internalizing the externality of greenhouse gases. And then this intriguing notion of, can we use a market instrument to direct that instrument to the place where it has greatest bang for buck? Again, in the jargon, and there's probably too much jargon in this space, to direct the investment to the point of lowest marginal abatement cost, where we can, reduce greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which is something we need to do urgently at the lowest cost. So that I hope is uncontroversial in the sense that that's a reasonable working idea. The difficulty, as has already been touched on, has been in the implementation. And my first point in this would be to appreciate that this market is a complete construct, but it's something that we created and we have to take responsibility for, and it has to be fit for purpose. And that purpose is a very tricky transition to net zero by 2050. That's kind of non-negotiable. And I think the evidence is not great on that in terms of carbon trading at the moment, right? But let's not lose sight of the fact that it's potentially still a compelling idea. We just haven't stewarded it very well at the moment. And that's, as Scott's already mentioned, it's probably because it's actually quite a difficult thing, and maybe we underestimated the difficulty to get right. And the regulators haven't exactly covered themselves in glory in this space. But it is a market that requires regulators. I always tell my colleagues, we trade the absence of a colorless, odorless gas. That's fundamentally the commodity that we're trying to trade here. That's quite an ephemeral thing to be transacting. And so you need some really, really clear principles as to, like how to use this thing and when a carbon credit is a carbon credit. And that's really the contest at the moment. And this is where I'm going to try and answer your question. But I mean, I think, building on what Scott's already said, any carbon credit in principle has to be permanently remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So, frankly, permanent in this context is probably 30 years. By 2050, this is either something that we've achieved or we're in a completely different space. So let's call permanence 30 years. That's not too difficult. It needs to be measured. Actually, through the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, we have increasingly good measurements around what is a ton of CO2 equivalent and what's not. The really difficult thing is additionality, this counterfactual. And, I think the lawyers always remind us that there's no proof for a counterfactual. So, and this is where the market's lost its way a bit. And so, I mean, my own sense is that really we need to take the hype out of the market. My real concern is that this market's hyped at the moment. It's, if you take the EU cap and trade system, it's roughly a $900 billion market last year. So this market's taking off, but it's doing nothing for the reduction of greenhouse gases. Okay, and I think that's really problematic. That's the disconnect we have to address. So my own thinking around this is to say, well, what do we want this market to do? It's going to play a very small role in reducing greenhouse gases. It's not a great decarbonization instrument. It's potentially a very useful climate finance instrument, but it's got a very limited role to play, I would argue, in decarbonization, in removing the billion tons of CO2 that we need to remove from our economy and society every year. But it can play a small role in that space. So, and this is where South Africa, I think, has got something right, and science-based targets more or less agrees with this, roughly 10%. I think that's probably the contribution that this market can make. And then we need to think, and this is the answer to your question in a very circuitous way, Alex, we need to think about what else we want this market to do. And we've shown that we just based on principles, i.e., let's alleviate poverty through our standard at the same time. So reduce carbon in a small, limited, but accountable way, and reduce poverty, because in the majority world, that's most of the developing countries, there's no ways we're going to achieve the rate or the scale of decarbonization that we require unless we link those efforts to poverty alleviation and to livelihood support. So, let's try and think about what else we want this market to do. We've shown that it's possible to support some quite small projects and to alleviate poverty while removing carbon. Other people want to support biodiversity. Other people want to support watersheds. Other people want to support coral reefs. That's great. But then let's design this thing to give us what we want and need, and let's just be humble about its contribution in the broader context. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Anton. Great kind of overview there. But Joanna, I want to bring you in here. You kind of shook things up towards the end of last year. You published a paper through your center called The Carbon Offset Industry Needs to be Abolished. Can you summarize the major concerns that you have on this, and let's see where we go with that discussion.
Thank you, Alex, and good morning, good evening, or good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for the space. I sort of build up from what Scott and Anton have been saying. I truly believe that polluters should pay for what they are polluting. The problem is that carbon markets do not do that. You know, history has shown that actually they are not paying, they are even winning money and allowing themselves to pollute even more than they used to do. We have enough years that we can say that the carbon markets have failed to reach what they attempt to do. So we can focus this discussion in different ways. So if we focus on the technicalities, so that's the additional part, the leakage, the permanence, those are, in my view, unresolvable issues that are since the beginning, since the inception of Kyoto, that was discussed. That's what the CDM didn't allow reforestation projects in a bigger scale. They are still unresolved, yet we have the most amount of the voluntary markets are based on forests. So we just kind of overlook the problems that we couldn't resolve and went anyways with it and expanded it and claimed that this is actually something that we can control, which is not possible. Just due to the problems and land power issues that are, you know, embedded in forests. So presidential changes will change the politics of a country, that will change completely how one scheme is thought of in 1 year, change completely after 5 years. Wildfires, just, you know, whatever can happen just will change. And the fact of permanence, for me, is crucial for thinking a little bit a step backwards on the assumptions of the carbon market. So if we do a little, you know, thinking of how it is conceived, we can see that they are doing all sorts of equivalences in the carbon market. So fossil fuel carbon can be equated to carbon that is absorbed in a forest. So basically what we're saying by that seemingly simple equation is that carbon is stored underground for millions of years that cannot be out in the atmosphere unless humans come with a machine and take it out, is equal to a carbon that is stored for a few years, even in the best of the cases, 100 years, let's say, on a forest, but it's not the same time scale. It is an airplane that emits carbon on a 2-hour flight is being absorbed for a plantation that is supposed to stay there for 50 to 100 years. That time scale we're assuming as equivalent, as the same, and we are just trading credits that have this assumption embedded. That is an unresolvable issue of how the system is designed, how it is thought about. So we're just making these equivalences of greenhouse gases, of times, of, you know, ways of absorbing, removing, avoiding emissions with the reality that fossil fuels are still being, you know, extracted from the ground and put into the atmosphere. So for me, these equivalences, these assumptions in the carbon market are something structurally in the design and make them flawed for what we need to do. So that is one part on the kind of stepping back. But when we see what is happening now, if we say, okay, these equivalences are there, we need to work with it. How it is designed, even though you accept these equivalences, you can see that, you know, the interests and how the rules of the game are made so that the more credits are in the system, the more benefits there are. So auditors, certifiers, developers, all the chain, the supply chain, if you wish, of a carbon credit benefits for the more credits to be in the market. They gain more money by this. So therefore, why would they say, no, this project does not have additionality? This project is not actually a good project. Why? There's no incentive to do that. On the other hand, as Scott was saying, the social aspects of the projects, and this is highly problematic because there are many certifications that claim to have social benefits, which I assume some projects do. But what happens when they don't have that, or they discover that there is some sort of real human right violation, or you know, some sort of violation in any level? Then even the community that is there is become dependent on the project. because that is normally the source of income. That is normally the project comes and says. So why would, they don't have an incentive to say, yeah, that project is bad, because the developer comes and say, well, if you say we're bad, we're going to live here. So it is a dependence mechanism. It's against one kind of this developmental aid that comes from the north to the south to say, we know how you can do better. We know how you can conserve the forest, but it is not truly developed from the people that have been guarding the forest, that have been living within. We don't have the time to go into so many details, but how it is designed, the system, it is not designed to really think about other possibilities. It's designed as a market, as a cost-effective mechanism. And because of that, there are so many interests at play and so many actors in the chain that at the end of the chain are usually the indigenous peoples, the small-scale farmers that have to deal with understanding a lot of language, a lot of jargon that is very, strange to them. And then come a lot of NGOs to try to help understanding this, but this comes also with political interests and with agendas at hand. And so it's difficult for them, in my experience, to really get their own agenda in place. Like, yes, we want our forest protected, but do we actually want that our forest allows another forest community to be impacted by an oil company extracting oil? No. I have been in forest communities saying to me, that is actually fundamentally wrong. Protecting my forest is actually making other forest people being, displaced or affected by the extraction of more fossil fuels, or by a factory that is polluting, or by, you name it, whoever is the buyer of that credit. So there are so many levels.
Can I pause you there, Joanna? Because I'd love to hear some feedback from others.
I'll leave it there.
No, thank you for that. I mean, just to say, you do mention in your paper the danger of a reproduction of, I think you call the colonial financial models taking place, and that this, talks against a just, the concept of a just transition. Scott, I saw you nodding your head there quite a lot, but I also know that you do see fundamental flaws with the carbon markets as they are at the moment, but you think they are fixable. Can you give some perspective on that, please?
Yeah, no, thanks. And very briefly, look, I mean, I think all the things I think that Joanna mentioned, particularly the forest guardians, are, that's the place to start. Is that, I mean, how do we work in partnership in order to look at some sustainable management of forest and to avoid deforestation? I mean, the broader question is what Anton, I think, had mentioned, is if you think about carbon markets as a way to engage the private sector in meeting Paris 1.5 targets. We know that the public overseas development assistance was promised and didn't arrive. And even if it did arrive, even that $100 billion did happen, that's a fraction of the, the multi-trillions that Nick Stern and others have identified for the green transition. So this ain't going to happen without the private sector. So then the question is, well, if you're an investor in the private sector, what are you looking for? Well, you're looking for something. You're looking for some kind of certainty around what a market looks like. You're looking around some kind of sense that you own the asset for however long, and because you own that asset, you can trade it. It's fungible, etc. And so, if you look from those perspectives, I think that this is fixable. I think some of the issues like additionality are solvable. I mean, a couple of ways of thinking about this. One is, I think probably given the state of, for those colleagues online that follow the voluntary carbon markets, there was one of the 4 largest certifiers, Vera, a really high-profile article came out, said basically 94% of all carbon credits issued under this big one are worthless. And there's been a whole bunch of other investigations. So if you start from, this is really going extraordinarily badly, I mean, how do you sort of jig this? And I think a couple of ways. So one is, nobody will do this, but just put a moratorium on land-based or nature-based carbon sequestration projects. And then what does that leave? Well, it leaves other things like technologies and other, other mechanisms to do this. And that, that may happen. I mean, you mentioned at the beginning, Alex, and I'll stop here, is under the Paris Climate Agreement, you look at one thing is one side is voluntary carbon markets, which are really now in the cellar. I think they're going to crawl out. And the other one is now sort of a slow start. You put it well on Paris, called Article 6, which involves government-to-government deals around international carbon markets. Those are now starting. We saw about 4 in 2023. It's involving an OECD country and developing countries. None of them involve forests. None of them involve agriculture. They're all involving technologies like solar, electric buses, and others. Maybe those will do better. I think I'll leave it there. I think the additionality issue is probably as complicated with technologies because of what Anton said, is that basically the good side is that solar and wind are cheaper than coal and oil. The bad side is you can't then show additional marginal abatement costs because it's now cheaper because of solar and wind. So the additionality part becomes even more complicated because of this.
Yeah, thank you for that. And the questions I can see are already coming in thick and fast. So let's just touch on a couple more points before we open it up. Anton, how do we regulate this market?
So this is such an important conversation. I'm really enjoying what people have contributed so far, right? Because it's a key issue because, and this is actually relates to one of the questions, this original market was codified under the Kyoto Protocol by the UNFCCC. There was a 9-year hiatus between the end of Kyoto in 2012 and the signing off of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement in Glasgow in 2021. And that's really where this voluntary market kind of put its hand up and blossomed. And that's actually where some of the problems have emerged as well. But we have a key moment now to say, what does good look like in this market? And for countries specifically to write their own rule books, their own rules of the game, as Joanna said, about this is what they want this market to do in their countries, in their backyards. Okay, and this is the issue of integrity that's been mentioned a couple of times. And I think Joanna raises such an important point. Like, can we really? And this is what makes it intellectually compelling, by the way. Can we really expect a market instrument to solve a problem that was caused by markets in many ways? Can we really expect capitalist flows of capital to address, or capitalist solutions to address something that was caused by capital allocations in the first place? These are really important questions to ask ourselves and to keep ourselves honest with. The reality is that we're out of time. And so we probably need a whole smorgasbord of instruments, and we need them all to work really well in the near term. So that brings us back to integrity. And I think it's not difficult to install integrity back in this market. And this is what I hope countries take up when they produce their Article 6 rulebooks, right? And this has already been mentioned. I mean, personally, we don't do any forest products. I think forests are crucial in the climate change conversation. I really like trees and I really like forests for all sorts of reasons. I just don't think carbon markets are going to help us with forests, right? So for example, we have already just taken it off the table, and that automatically brings integrity to the system because that's where a lot of the problems incubate. The other thing is what Joanna has mentioned. We have to shorten the chain between the buyer and the seller. That's how markets work, right? Somehow this market has convinced itself that the market's comprised of consultants and auditors and gatekeepers of gatekeepers. No, if I were to buy a carbon credit, I would actually want to go and see where my money's going to meet the people who get the money. And so I think there's some very simple questions, Alex, to answer your question. There's some very simple questions you can ask of a carbon market. Say, how much of the buyer's rand is getting to the ground? What impact is it having on the ground? And, can you do this without massive transaction costs, i.e. can you support some small community-based livelihood enhancing initiatives without having to go to the massive forest projects? And with the forest projects, by the way, I would add the cook stove projects, because I work a lot in African countries. They don't need more cook stoves. They need electricity, renewable electricity to reach every household. Cook stoves are a nice idea. The Western world's latched onto this, and so many carbon credits are generated by cook stoves. What we need that investment to do is to go and give every household on the African continent clean energy, clean, safe energy through grids or microgrids. That's where the investment needs to flow. So I don't think it's that complicated. I think it's still possible to get this right. We just need some very clear and deliberate thinking and design around this market. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm beginning to think we might need 2 hours on this discussion. There's so much there and so much wealth. But Joanna, I want to come back to you. I mean, there's accusation against the corporate sector, particularly around greenwashing in terms of offsetting their residual emissions or part of their carbon footprints. But I just want to highlight a paper or a report that came out in Time magazine not too long ago, where they analyzed, I think it was 7,000 companies who some had engaged in the carbon markets and some hadn't. And the findings were that those that had engaged in the carbon markets, whether controversial or not, were climate leaders in both in their industries and the economies in which they operate, i.e. these are companies that have engaged with their carbon and their climate change issues that affect their operations, and also taken into consideration, the ambitions of the world to achieve 1.5 degrees Celsius. So there's a little bit of attention coming in where the private sector is saying, well, we carry such reputational risk around investing in the carbon markets, that actually maybe we're going to pull out. We will not direct our cash towards that, even though they are climate leaders and are typically the ones who are proactively reducing their emissions as fast as possible and just using offsets to cover the residual. So I'd like to hear your viewpoints on that, because are we saying, or are you saying throw the carbon market out completely and think about something different? Or is there space to actually accommodate different approaches?
Thank you, Alex. That question is, it cannot be in a short time, but I will try to say my main thought, because I would actually challenge what a climate leader is nowadays. I don't believe that the major polluting companies can by no means be climate leaders. And, it's also a marketing way of, you do actions here and there. But I do understand that a lot of companies put their reputation at risk by doing this, but they have to as well, because their reputations are at risk already, with more and more scrutiny by citizens and international organizations saying we need to stop, polluting. So they know they have to do something. There's no choice for them. So they are not doing it out of goodwill necessarily, but it is a business plan. It is something that they need to think, because the world is changing, they want it or not. The point of being is are we having the real conversation we need to have for solving the thing that we're saying we're supposed to solve, which is climate change? So carbon markets is not the answer for me. I don't think that that is the main policy we have at the table. We like it or not, it along the world, carbon markets, are being used as the main policy. The World Bank has crossed around the South to do readiness phases to change legislations on countries to allow carbon markets to happen. And that is coming when it's on a specific agenda. It's not coming from the countries within saying what is best for us. It is not coming from a just question of, do we need energy access for all our citizens? Or are the fossil fuels that we're allowed extracting going to our own energy, or are going to the industry that is allowing more, destruction or pollution that is even going to the same countries? So I think the conversation is not starting with an honest accountability of what got us into this problem and what needs to change. It's an uncomfortable conversation. It is a conversation that is going to hit to the actors that have the most power in our economy, unfortunately. But if we don't have that conversation, if we don't say, well, the energy that we're extracting, the fossil fuels that we have, that we will need, needs to go to the places that we know is needed, especially prioritarily. And that cannot be traded around. We need to cap, we need to tax the rich, we need to stop certain things and, change a little bit how we are used to do our economy. That's the conversation that I think we need to have.
Okay, thank you. I think in any scenario where there are winners and losers, the conversation can get uncomfortable, but that's what we need to be doing. I'm going into questions now that are coming through. And like I say, there are many, and thank you very much to the audience for these. This first one, Scott, I'm going to direct to you because I have a suspicion that you were actually around and possibly involved in this. The question is, how successful was the CDM mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol? And particularly considering the market collapse in it? And are we in danger of doing the same thing again under the Paris Agreement?
Yeah, short answer is yes. I think for those of you who haven't followed, so the Clean Development Mechanism was set up under Kyoto. It's now carried over, something called the Paris Article 6.4. There was pre-2012 around 6,000 projects the price went from the initial price of around 25 euros a ton. And by 2012, it collapsed to less than €0.5 a ton. And there are a bunch of different reasons for that. I mean, one of them was just a flood of certificates in the market. There were more sellers than there were buyers. They tried to fix it, and it kind of regained to some extent post-2012. The problem is all the issues that we talked about before, additionality, really just a sort of a gong show. There were 250 different baselines used under the clean development mechanisms, meaning a whole bunch of different starting gates for how you start to do the measurement. For me, the biggest concern from lessons learned from the clean development mechanism were lots of integrity issues. But nevertheless, because countries had invested in those carbon credits, they were able to carry over around 300 million of legacy clean development mechanism credits into the current Article 6.4 mechanism. And to me, this is not a good start. So in an ideal world, you would have thought, and a lot of these are like financial markets, right? So if you look at how the EU's emissions trading system has worked, same thing, oversupply of markets, government went in, they withdrew about 900 million emission credits. A lot of this is like monetary policy. But trying to get the equilibrium in terms of what a price clearing would look like. But I mean, I think the problem with what we are right now with the Article 6 is that this is a negotiation. It's not a market. Every government sits at the table, and that's how the UN works. And so the process is we're not going to give up the credits that we had owned under a previously flawed mechanism as we restart a new one. So for me, this is really a really sort of a deeply worrying start to now how Article 6, particularly Article 6.4, is something called the supervisory body. So all credits need to go, all projects need to go through the supervisory body, and that's different from something called Article 6.2, where we're seeing direct bilateral government-to-government deals. And they're by contrast, they actually look rule light. They actually look like we'll do the deals and figure out the rules after the fact. And so it's kind of a weird early steps in Article 6.
Okay, thank you for that. I mean, we also do now have, I think it's called the International Council for Integrity of the Voluntary Carbon Market, obviously set up by players in that market one way or the other. They are putting together standards, issuing and publishing various standards, etc. I guess the proof will be in the pudding ultimately as to how effective that is. Anton, I want to bring you in again. There are a couple of questions here that I think you can answer very, very quickly before I put a more detailed question to you. There is questions around the difference between a carbon credit and a carbon offset. Is there an easy answer to that?
Yeah, fundamentally the same thing. You need a credit, and then you can use that in a transaction, which we call an offset.
Okay, thank you.
The contest is around what is a credit and what's not a credit. Until you've got one, you can't offset anything.
Right, and the credibility thereof of that credit. Very quickly, again, two questions coming in from the same member of the audience. The idea of being able to pollute in one country or one part of the world and offset that through a credit in another part, is that contentious? And I think you will have a viewpoint on that. And then similarly, the time frame that one buys a credit in, how do you apportion that to what year of emissions in your carbon footprint?
Well, those are good questions, really good questions. I mean, on the original idea emanated from this notion of the global commons, that the atmosphere doesn't really matter where you put the pollution in or where you take it out. There's this blanket of greenhouse gas that's responsible for anthropogenic climate change, global warming. And so, maybe it would be cheaper for companies or for countries, say Germany, to reduce emissions in an African country, for example, than it would be to do it in their own backyard. And by the way, that was a very compelling idea for us as Africans, because we, in a stylized sense, Africa could have positioned itself as having a global carbon credit. We aren't responsible for very many emissions, and we could have been, this was certainly what drew my attention in the early days, we could have been the beneficiary of inward flows of investment from wherever this effort was being made around the world. But But I do think how that's transpired is that people have sort of used this to get off the hook a little bit, and that the primary responsibility does start in your own backyard. And that's my point, is that I think we should be capping the offset or the carbon trading component to at maximum 10% of our effort to reduce greenhouse gases. And that then, if you do that, that then puts the onus back in what's happening in your own factory, within your own borders, in your own country, and it forces you to make some quite hard and possibly more expensive changes there, but at least you are overseeing them and you're responsible for them. The issue of timing is important. We talk about vintages of carbon credits. Unlike wine, I think older vintages are less valuable, right? And so I think there is a massive emphasis, and the market's quite good at doing this. I think there's a price differential for more recent vintages. Stuff that was emitted, or emissions that were avoided long ago, are sort of considered to be banked and tend to have a very low value in the market. And that's maybe the sort of thing which the market is quite useful at doing. But yeah, I guess there probably are, and Joanna will, I'm sure, jump in here, there probably are some very old and some very junkish credits still floating around the system. It's just no one accountable to any global standard would buy those, I think.
Right. So, okay, I'm going to come back to another question around kind of gold standards, etc. But just for clarity purposes, you're talking about that 10%, that maximum the carbon markets could address. Is that on the voluntary side, or is that also on the international public market?
Well, currently there's no cap, right? Let's just be clear. So this is just an idea that I'm floating. I think it's a good idea. In South Africa, as I think you probably know, Alex, under the carbon tax system, you can reduce 10% of your carbon tax liability by offsetting. So it's capped at 10%. And by the way, the Science Based Targets Initiative, for companies that sign up to that, of their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, never mind the jargon, but they can only really reduce sort of 8 to 10% of their carbon liability, their carbon footprint, by offsetting. So science-based targets, countries like South Africa are sort of saying, we want to use this instrument, but in a very measured and proportionate way. This is not a complete solution to the problem of climate change. Personally, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's not an idea that has any regulatory or kind of legal standing at the moment, but I think it's one that we should be trying to push.
Right. Scott, you got your hand up?
Yeah, just a 30-second, just on Anton's point. China has just reintroduced its certified emission market, and under that system, it's 5%. So companies that actually have a net zero target, they're allowed to offset by a total of 5%. So I think it's great, really great. And perhaps we'll see other regulatory approaches.
So we're seeing a little bit of differentiation between anticipated volumes in different countries, but it is interesting that it's viewed as relatively minor in the bigger scheme of things. Joanna, a thank you has come into you for presenting the challenges that you have, and it comes with a question to you. What are the policy and institutional reforms that the kinds of challenges you're talking about should be implemented, particularly, and it's reference to African countries, but I'm going to include the Global South in its entirety on that, if you don't mind.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very important question. There are many ways to respond to that question, but one that comes to my head right now is a kind of common argument that is played or used to justify carbon offsets, which is the needed funds that the South needs to do the transition, right? The much needed funds. So how else would the South get funds for doing a transition? So carbon markets are seen to be the kind of most evident way. I would argue that the South should have a debt relief. So all the money that the South is paying for the debt that is actually caused by what we know historical process that we're not going to get into should be released right now. And that money should be going to funds for the South to get into a transition that is, developed and designed by regional institutions and not far away or in another agencies that have different agendas. That's a way that the South could get a different type of funding. Another way of getting these much needed funds, which are evidently a reality, could be to actually tax, not a carbon tax that could be played necessarily as with offsets, like we see it even with a cap, but really tax the rich, so the companies that have, or the elites that have an excess of wealthness, and that is debatable, I know, but there is enough money in the world to be used. It's just distributed in a very wrong way. So if we actually want the transition to happen in a fair and just way, getting energy access to all, but having the transition that is, you know, really for that specific context. So the transition that is good for Nigeria is not the same transition that is good for Peru, where I come from, or the transition that is, you know, for Philippines is not the same that is for another country. So each country needs to think of its own transition as much as Europe thinks of its own transition, and the US as well. So thinking in that priority, then each country has to have, or region has to have, you know, its own way of addressing this. And for sure, there is a climate justice debt that has to be repaid. And I know that there is not enough money in terms of, you know, governments donating, but there is enough money that is being kept from the south to the north still that I think could be, you know, redirected.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, I've got another question that I'm going to direct to you. So companies that are trying to reach net zero emissions by 2050, which is effectively the ambition of the Paris Agreement to keep us within 1.5 degrees of warming. Once you know, it's total carbon abatement is probably impossible. The idea under the science-based targets of reducing your emissions by 90% and then being able to offset the residual, etc. In the absence of carbon markets, what would you suggest to organizations who are trying to do that?
Okay, so I think there are many ways again on you know, seeing the big problems that we have at task, because it is a complicated issue, and I want to again put the power and the politics on the climate change problem. So I think most of what I'm trying to transmit is, you know, when we see the politics of climate change, we see that there's many avenues where we can go around. So, you know, debt is one of these, but also land reform. You know, the REDD projects, forest projects are based on the current land tenure system of these countries that are mostly based on colonial legacies of how land was being set up or transferred to certain actors and not others. And, you know, this kind of pile up of, you know, not looking at the real structural issues that we need to think about, as well as energy. Where does energy go, for whom, and how much? You know, these questions are the necessary questions again. I think I would like my colleagues to also answer that question, because I think it's a very nice discussion, and I bring in a perspective that I think is nice to share.
I will open it up to them, Joanna. Anton, your thoughts on
that? Maybe too much time with the IPCC has made me a little jaded, but what I've learned to appreciate there is that they're going to have to be compromises involved. I'm kind of currently working with this idea of a just transition, but that's based around settlements. We need some sort of climate settlement, right? Some sort of compact on which we can all agree. And you know, the one thing that the carbon market has been able to do is bring business to the table, and I think that is quite important, that we shouldn't lose sight of that. I do think that we now have an incredible opportunity, as Jonas said, for countries under Article 6. So, you know, under the Kyoto Protocol, in a very stylized way, said, here's the rule book, go and apply it in your country. That didn't work very well, as Scott has pointed out. Under Paris Agreement in Article 6, there's sort of a shift in emphasis saying, you bring us your rule book and we'll tell you if it's fit for purpose or not. And so this is a golden opportunity for countries. And by the way, I'm much in favor of democratically elected governments writing this rule book than NGOs or, you know, self-appointed carbon standards. So I think it's a great opportunity. And then, you know, there are some very good things which this market could help finance. I mean, just to give you, you know, things that we try and emphasize in the projects that we support, it's landfill avoidance. So that's the circular economy. It's soil organic carbon that's measured in the laboratory, that we can actually get an exact measurement on it. It's renewable energy replacing coal in coal-fired grids. It's clean, it's fossil fuel-free mobility. It's energy efficiency in households. These are things which we're going to need. And the carbon market, you know, if it just focuses on getting money to the people who are delivering this, not the consultants and the auditors and the standards of standards, but the people who are actually doing the hard work on the ground, I think it's still useful in this space. And then just to pick up on the one question that was in the chat, no, we should never be forward trading carbon. We should only be counting stuff that's been signed off by a third-party auditor, applying an agreed-upon set of the rules, ideally a rule book written by a democratically elected government. And there shouldn't be no forward trading, because that's precisely where we incubate the risk of give me the money now and I'll deliver the carbon in the future. Guess what? The carbon never arrives when people take the money. So that's not very helpful.
Okay, thank you on that. Scott, I'm going to bring you in, but also with that, I want to just raise a point here. Anton listed a number of potential project types that we haven't really spoken about. We've spoken a lot about forest, and there's been a lot of discussion about cook stoves and whatnot, but there are other very viable carbon credit types of projects out there. Are we going into a potential future where we're going to see almost a rating of different types of projects? You know, it's in a similar way to how the rating agencies rate corporate bonds or sovereign bonds. You know, will a similar thing naturally happen within the carbon market, where you'll be able to purchase a low risk carbon credit versus one that might be of higher risk?
Yeah, I mean, there may be a couple of ways of this rating emerging. I mean, one is not finding yourself in the Guardian. I mean, I know some of the big certifiers have said we don't want to get Guardian. So just actually, you know, passing the sort of sunlight test, of sunshine test, does this actually pass muster? I mean, I think that, you know, it's back to this question of what's the role of regulators. And I think something to watch, particularly, you know, we're talking about high integrity. The opposite of that is greenwashing. And, you know, the European Union, for example, is now bringing in new regulations around green claims. Is that, you know, companies it looks like they're not going to be able to even use the term net zero in the future. And then they actually have to demonstrate their actions in a substantive, measurable, and comparable way. So I think the list that Anton just gave are exactly the list of the pending projects now in the pipeline under Article 6, that there are no, to my knowledge, maybe it changed the last couple of days, but there are no nature-based solutions, land-based sequestration proposed projects. It's industrial energy efficiency, it's solar, it's wind, it's electric transportation. I think there's some around circular economy and waste. And so those are the things that would actually have, you know, they're let me put it this way, they're more measurable. And the last thing to mention on this is that if you go back to this question, it's, you know, I look now that the sort of the pace of green technology innovation is really moving really quickly. And I suspect that what we see today will look very different from what we see 5 years from now, is that comparative costs are actually plunging. And, you know, one example of this is that this project now that Denmark has built a long transmission cable to connect it to the United Kingdom, so Denmark can sell clean energy to the UK. There's now a new pending project from Morocco going also to the UK, where Morocco has, I think, 3,000 hours of sunshine a year. The UK has about 600 to 900 hours of sunshine a year. And I think this question of international cooperation and international partnerships around carbon markets is that countries have different comparative advantages on how they can get to carbon neutrality. And that's the idea behind this. But it's gone sideways for different reasons, including people gaming the system.
Okay, it's a lot of additional questions that come in and points, for example, around the opening up of stock exchanges to carbon trading, etc. That's an interesting one. There's a lot of questions around alternative types of projects and the need for robust science around them. I think that goes back to the sequestration values and characteristics of things like forests, etc. So that is very interesting. But one thing that we haven't touched on, which I would like to, is one of the objectives of carbon trading, as it is described in Article 6, is to actually facilitate and incentivize low-cost transfer of technology from the developed to the developing, or to the global north to global south. Are we seeing that happen? Scott, first to you, and then Joanna after you.
Yeah, so just very, very briefly, excuse me, I mean, the Paris Agreement says all countries need to cooperate on technology transfer. So the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, just came out with a report in 2023. So guess what? The largest 5 producers of green technology. So China's the leader, and the other 4 are, Germany and other OECD countries. So the largest manufacturers, the largest exporters, and the largest importers are all China plus 4. There's not one single developing country that has benefited substantively at scale on technology transfer. This deal and the promise that has been around now for years on technology transfer has utterly failed. And I think, again, looking at, we need to change how this is working, or we're all going to be in even worse conditions than we are now. So I think there's models of technology transfer. The Montreal Protocol on ozone depletion shows that it can work, but the scale of Paris is something which is obviously something that's never been tried before. But right now, to me, among the sort of absolute failures of the international system is around technology transfer. And the World Trade Organization hasn't helped very much on this at all.
Okay, thank you for that. Joanna, have you got any perspective?
Yes, I will also add a little bit to the previous conversation, just one line, saying that let's not forget that, how the more renewable energy that the world is able to produce, we're still increasing the fossil fuel extraction that we are extracting as a world. So this is going in parallel. So, what it means is that our energy consumption overall is increasing rather than reducing. It doesn't mean just because we forget that we say, oh, how much energy, renewable energy we're producing, this is a good thing, obviously, but as long as we don't cut our fossil fuel energy consumption, there is no win on that. We're still increasing. And that's part of what carbon trading allows, this increase in parallel. At the same thing for the technology transfer, I think there is also a conversation to be had of which kind of technology has to be transferred and to whom and by whom and who is owning the technology, because that is something that we have seen in history with intellectual property rights and these kind of things. So you transfer a technology, but then you're dependent on certain owners and, then you're not really benefiting from that technology. There is a lot of technology coming from the South that is not even considered as this transfer to the other side of the world, and that should be a discussion. There's many countries that have put forward different alternatives on energy systems, on local energy production that is not even considered because it's not business profiting. So there's a conversation there, and again, we need to be honest on what are we trying to achieve with these policies.
Okay, thank you very much. Most unfortunately, we need to start to wrap up here. Just a couple of apologies from my side. One is my challenges with lighting in the room that I'm in at the moment. So that was unexpected. But also apologies if I've not been able to get to all the questions that have come through. They've been absolutely fantastic. Just to give you reassurance, we do collect the questions, we collate them, and then we actually do distribute them to the panelists themselves after the recording. So please be aware of the fact and confident in the fact that we will try our level best to, if we weren't able to raise the question today in the webinar, we will get it answered for you. I just want to finish off very, very quickly. Yes or no answer. I know Anton and Scott think that the market needs to adapt and needs to change itself. But very yes or no answer. Are we in danger of losing the carbon credit market in its entirety as we know it now? Scott.
Yeah. Yes, we are.
Anton.
No, I think the danger is that it will persist in some form which is not very useful.
Thank you. Yeah. Joanna?
I hope so, but I don't think so.
Okay.
Is that
all
fair
right.
enough?
That's a range. That is a broad spectrum. Thank you very much to the three of you. It's been a fantastic discussion. Thank you to all the attendees. We can see the applause coming in from far and wide, so thank you very much. Caroline, I'm going to come back to you, and from my side, just a thank you to the ESG Exchange for hosting this discussion.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thanks very much to all the panelists. As you said, Alex, we will be collating the questions and sending them out to the panelists and putting the answers up onto the event page. The recording is available from the event page. And if you have registered for CPD certificates, your certificates will be sent to you in the course of the next 12 to 24 hours. So thank you again, everybody, and we're looking forward to seeing you on our next webinar. Thank you, Alex. Thanks, panelists.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very
Thank you,
much.
Alex.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheerio.
Thank you.
Bye.